Greetings, everyone. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and thank you so much for joining us for our very important program, updating the contentious issues about Ukraine. I'm very happy to have our team, our expert team with us again. It's just so great that you're here. Thank you, Tim and Oksana and Gideon. Gideon is our moderator, and from prior programs, you know that he's the Mary and David Boyes Distinguished Fellow, and he is with the Foreign Policy Council on Foreign Relations, and he was the former editor of Foreign Affairs for 10 years. So there's more on Gideon on our website, but I'm going to turn the program over to Gideon so he can start this very important discussion. Thank you, Gideon.
Thank you,
Over
Rhoda.
to you.
Thank you, Rhoda, and thanks all of you. We have a depressing subject, but a fabulous panel as usual. Tim FRYE is the Marshall D. Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia and an extraordinary expert on all things in the region. Oksana Shevel is an Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at Tufts. And both of them have written extensively on the area, on the conflict, teach about it. Their full bios are in the chat, which I encourage you to explore. If I were to read them, it would take all of our time. So I'm going to cut right to the chase. We were talking before about how this—
I just want to say one thing, Gideon,
Sure.
One thing, because I'm going to go become part of the audience, but I wanted to remind the audience that they should submit their questions throughout the program.
You should submit questions. We're going to be basically running through where we are, how we got here, and where we go forward, and trying to answer whatever questions we can. This war has not only been extraordinarily tragic for everybody involved, but particularly Ukraine and Ukrainians and the forced conscripts from Russia who have had to bear the brunt. But it's also been humbling for anybody who studies it, because I don't know of any single expert anywhere on any part of it who has gotten their predictions for what would happen correct at every point along the way. I wrote a big article most recently in Foreign Affairs after a recent trip in the spring, incorporating all the latest things that I thought I had learned about the war in the first year and a half of it, and promptly proceeded to be humbled, like everybody else, by the slow progress of the Ukrainian counteroffensive over the summer and fall, and people who I had sort of almost confidently ridiculed for their excessive caution proved out to be more correct. And we're in an interesting and very difficult situation in which the war itself has proved to become something of a slog with very, very hard to move front lines in the absence of air superiority on either side. And the support that seemed to be solid for the war, or at least sustainable at the very least until the 2024 election, has started to evaporate thanks to political shenanigans and rising isolationism in the US Congress, which has really put the war not just at an intellectually interesting moment, but at a practically desperate moment. And I'm very curious to hear what Oksana and Tim have to say, because I can't think of anybody else better equipped to guide us to where we are. So let's start for a second with what's happened since our last panel, which was a much ballyhooed Ukrainian offensive, which many had hoped would continue building on the success of their offensives last fall and the stalemated Russian offensive in the spring to produce a real momentum in Ukraine's favor. But it didn't achieve that. And now we're pretty much stuck where we were a year ago, except with a lot more destruction having occurred and a lot less support for continuing the fight in the West. Tim, what did you think about what's happened since our last meeting? Did the war go as you expected? And where do you assess the progress for movement now, if at all, strictly on the battlefield?
Um, one thing the Russians are good at is digging trenches and lobbing artillery shells. And the initial stages of the war were tactics that Russia's not good at, moving quickly, being nimble, improvising. You know, the lightning strike is not what the Russian military was built to do. Um, but what Russia has long experience of doing is being able to lob artillery shells, sometimes accurately, often not, but always to great destruction. Uh, and their ability to dig trenches and fortify their lines um, during that interregnum where Ukraine was waiting for US aid and marshaling its own forces and preparing to conduct the counteroffensive. Russia made a lot of progress in terms of digging itself in and making it difficult to dislodge. And, you know, stepping back, there's a lot of moving the goalposts here. I mean, if in April or March of 2022, you would have said, you would have asked most people if the borders look they do today, that would have been seen as a resounding victory for Ukraine. So, in essence, the ability of the Ukrainians to beat back the Russians earlier in the year and in late 2022, that has kind of raised the goalpost, to use another sports metaphor, so that now it seems as if it's defeat if they don't kick the Russians, all the way back to the 1991 borders. So, I think we need to think about the bigger picture here and how really successful, Ukraine has been in not in achieving all of its goals, but certainly performing better than many had expected. And we'll see what happens with what's become a stalemate or a slow progress or a less dynamic front. We'll have to see what happens over time. It's difficult to see the Russians making a big breakthrough, although we can't rule that out. And Ukraine continues to kind of peck away and threaten Crimea and make life difficult for the Russians. But as you said, there hasn't been the kind of breakthrough that I think many of us hoped for.
Okay, I'm going to press you on some of those points, but let me go to Akana first. How has what's happened over the last since our last meeting, the time period since our last meeting during essentially the summer and fall, not about the American politics, but about the course of the war on the battlefield. How has that proceeded in ways that either conformed or disconformed to your expectations?
Yeah, I will start by echoing what Tim said, that we can't really sort of exclude various possibilities now. So it's not that, as you said, that many experts, well, all experts, as you said, didn't get everything right. And I think, I would be cautious about any kind of currently spun scenarios that things are going this way and that's the way. I mean, things could still go quite different ways. But if we, again, to your question, the developments since last time we talked, I mean, this fact, again, reinforce what Tim said, that the fact that Ukrainians were able to beat not only the original Russian advance, but also to regain about half of the territory that Russia seized. That's, and since then haven't lost more substantial territory. I think that's by itself is quite, impressive, and really, the question could be asked, like, why is Russia failed, right? Like, not why Ukrainian, or at least not only why Ukrainian counteroffensive didn't succeed. Now, that said, I think with the counteroffensive, we'll probably have this debate going on for a long time, and it began even before the counteroffensive began. This issue, or this certainly is how it was seen in Ukraine, that military aid was coming too slow in these sort of increments, like teaspoons, as they say in Ukraine. And had it come more decisively earlier, maybe we would have seen different results, right? So the problem is that not only there wasn't air support, and many military experts said no Western military would have attempted anything like this, even outside the fact that Russians had time to dig in, large-scale operation like this. And then, this pattern that we saw that, first Germany sends helmets, right? US sends stingers. So it takes time to, for the West to be able to be prepared to send this more serious weapons. And then, of course, in the meantime, Russians have time to dig in. But then, there are other experts who have been saying that there were some problems with sort of Ukrainian, military, the way it was trained, like it wouldn't operate in these combined operations, as well as, for example, NATO military. So again, I'm saying that this debate sort of why, the counteroffensive was not more successful probably will go on for quite some time. And now, given where things are now, it seems like we are certainly looking at a protracted war. And I think the question that many would be asking now, if, say, Western aid, given this conundrum in the US Congress, if, say, more Western military aid does not materialize, could things begin to change decisively in Russia's favor? I think this is something we'll probably talk, I imagine, later today. But I would, again, emphasize the fact that Ukrainians, if they pursue this two-pronged strategy to which they now seem to be leaning, first of all, to reinforce the defense, and defense is somewhat easier than offense, right? So just like they have difficult time advancing, Russia has very difficult time advancing. This active fighting around this town of Avdiivka in Donbass, by some accounts, they are losing like 1,000 people a day, and they have advanced, a few hundred meters in months. So that's, really, really costly, just like, it was costly for the Ukrainians. And then, as Tim was mentioning, that it's not really frozen conflict as such, because Ukrainians continue to damage Russia, right, or to cause problems for Russia in these different ways that they can, in the Black Sea, with the strikes behind the enemy lines. There is some activity on the left bank Kherson. There was an interview today or yesterday with the head of the Ukrainian security service, and he said we are poking Russia in the heart with the needle all the time. So I think this sort of the combination of effective defense and sort of the strategic nimble advances, not like major counteroffensive probably anytime soon at least, but these, continuing to keep pressure on Russia, I think it's more likely than some kind of frozen conflict, as in like there is a ceasefire, there is some kind of agreement, right? There is some sort of end. Again, we can talk for reasons why that is. So I'll maybe start with these comments.
Okay, so this is great. And I want to dig in on exactly these points. The reason I want to get to this question about is the war on the ground actually sort of movable is because it does lead into questions of like what strategy is possible can affect what strategy is desirable. And there's an argument that is gaining, I think, increasing ground among military analysts that what we're seeing here in Ukraine on the ground after the flurry of initial moves, both poorly thought out offensives by the Russians, brilliant defenses with national heroism by the Ukrainians, then surprise attacks forward by the Ukrainians in the north around Kharkiv against unprepared Russian areas. Since a year or so ago, things have not moved much on the ground in Ukrainian territory. And there's an argument that's increasingly being made by military analysts that this is a function of the logic of conventional war absent air superiority in the current era of technology, which is with the ability to spot and attack attacking forces. It is very hard to make progress against trained defenses when you have no air superiority. And as you said, NATO wouldn't expect you to achieve anything more. And so the question is, if that is in fact what we're seeing, the Russians unable to do more in last spring, the Ukrainians unable to do more over the summer and fall, the Russians unable to do more, as you've just said, in the later fall. Is it possible for anything to happen on the ground, even if you were to continue aid versus that? Now, and then I want to ask that question to you guys, because there's a separate set of questions around Crimea and the war, ironically, in the Black Sea, where Ukraine without a navy is somehow having its best fights against the Russian Navy and against Crimea by sort of attacking logistics and increasingly pushing the Russians back. So that seems to be an area of potential further progress for Ukraine in the south. But even if you were to have continued military aid, do either of you see significant potential for moving, let's say, the front lines on the ground over the next year? Either one of you.
Oksana, do you want to jump in or do you want me to go?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, I can start. So I think if we try to think sort of what is likely given, current reality, if I had to make like some kind of bet, I would probably say it's not very likely that in the next year we would see, big movements, barring some extraordinary events, like, for example, if Putin dies, right? Or if, I don't know, like all aid was somehow to dry up for Ukraine, like completely, and say the army somehow collapsed, right? These seem pretty drastic scenarios that are not very likely. Now, that said, I think sort of when people ask this question, I don't know if you sort of have this kind of bigger also background in mind, is like, if this is the outcome, like, isn't it so terrible that we have to do something different, right? Like, in other words, this is an unacceptable scenario.
So that's a separate question.
Yeah.
I'm just asking
Okay.
the question of what you do about this, such a kind of difficult situation, is separate.
Okay. So
that
then
actually exists.
let's leave that. So let's just talk about then, the likelihood. I think what we need to look at in order to be maybe like, not obviously nobody can predict for sure, but at least to have like informative speculation, right, for lack of a better word, what's more likely to happen. I think we have to, first of all, not take some of these kind of spins that are in the media for granted. For example, this argument that because Russia is a bigger country and it has more people and the sanctions haven't, collapsed its economy, like, of course, it can withstand this sort of thing for a long time. I think that's really an open question. I mean, again, many have said that Russian economy is actually not that resilient, given its size, given how much more stronger the West is economically. So this idea, if sort of in the long war Russia really has an edge, I think that's at the very least a question. And some might say, well, again, of course, it depends what happens in the West. Sort of another kind of piece of facts to factors to look for is what actually happens in the West. As you said, there is this issue obviously in U.S. Congress. But there are now other things being discussed more seriously than they were before, like the seizure of Russian assets or interest from these assets, which is a lot of money. So again, if sort of the obstacle is finding finances for aiding Ukraine's continued military effort, like there is this potential as a possibility, which before sort of didn't seem to be on the table and now is on the table, right? And then, of course, what happens within Ukraine is also important, because it is true that, Ukraine is a smaller country, the military has been exhausted. There are now sort of domestic politics is returning in a way that this, unity at the beginning of the war completely canceled any kind of divisions. I mean, we still have substantial unity. There was actually a poll just 2 weeks ago, maybe even less, that asked, it was after it became clear that in the US Congress there is problem with continued military funding, and people were asked, like, if, say, Western funding does dry up, like, do we continue to fight or do we try to, have some sort of negotiations? And substantial majority, I think close to 70%, said we continue to fight. Again, we can talk about why, but that's sort of this kind of domestic dynamics in Ukraine, I think, would be another piece to look at. So between all of these three pieces, as I said, like if I were sort of asked to make a guess today, I would say still seems like unlikely that there would be major change on the battlefield one way or the other. But any of these sort of three parts of factors, developments within the West, issues and domestic developments in Ukraine, and also what happens in Russia, that could affect it quite substantially.
Okay, thank you. Tim, over to
Yeah.
you. Same question.
Yeah.
And I want a particular question. Is it possible that there could be continued progress in the Black Sea and Crimea, even if the land war is essentially landlocked for a while?
Yeah, I think that's where Ukraine has had, the most success with, using kind of drone technology and to strike behind enemy lines and to they haven't been able to cut off Crimea the way that they have hoped, which would have been really damaging to Russian forces. And the Russians have done a little bit better inland than they have in Crimea. So we have to keep in mind that this front is enormous. It's more than 1,000 miles long. So, to talk about the war, you're better off talking about lots of engagements along a huge, huge front. So, that is the good news and the bad news. One is that, you have to defend a very, very long territory, so it does make you vulnerable. On the other hand, it makes it difficult to concentrate forces for either side to really punch through. And the other interesting thing on the military side is I sometimes feel like this is like a 19th century and a 21st century war at the same time, in that you have these incredible advances in drone technology and all of the high tech surveillance mechanisms, electronic warfare that's really very cutting edge. But just the raining down of artillery shells on Ukraine, this is old school technology that unfortunately Russia can do for a long time. Regardless kind of what happens on the ground, even if there is a Ukrainian breakthrough from Russian territory, they could still cause an awful lot of damage. I want to say maybe I'll stop there, but I do want to get to the staying power of Russia. That's something I have some thoughts about. But
so I definitely want to get to that, but I want to do one more counterfactual first about where we are, because essentially there have been, as far as I can see it, there are kind of two counterfactuals for how we got here. The one that some people have argued could have been quite different. One is something that you alluded to, or that was alluded to, which was that, if only there had been more U.S. Maybe it was Oksana. If only there had been more U.S. aid or Western aid earlier of a higher quality, then that could have been followed up and produced a breakthrough. Others have said, no, what we've seen about this war over the last year kind of shows that no matter what you would have done in this period, it's really hard to see anybody being able to develop a breakthrough capability given the intersection of technology and geography and realities of war in this particular conflict. Do either of you think that if U.S. aid had been quicker or more extensive in a plausibly realizable way, that the outcome would have been different, or would still be stuck where we are now?
My sense is that the Biden administration has been concerned about escalation, and that's
the second question I want to ask you. But let's say they hadn't been concerned and had given more, would the outcome be different?
Well, we don't know how Russia might have responded. That's like the counterfactual to your counterfactual. Now it seems like we know that Russia's really willing to tolerate a lot of U.S. involvement and to have its red lines be repeatedly crossed without significantly escalating. If we would have known that earlier, I think more aid would have flown in, and I think it might have been able to have some effect, but it is really difficult to know.
Oksana, if they had not been self-deterred and had managed or desired to send more aid to Ukraine earlier of a higher quality, would that have had a significant likelihood of changing the military fortunes of the war over the past year?
Yeah, I would take your question, even sort of start answering it potentially from an earlier point, because this idea that, the West was, of course, Russia, and some realists are saying the West provoked Russia, quote unquote, but I think more like, given the evidence, actually the West has been very deferential to Russia, exactly avoiding escalation, not sanctioning Russia, not punishing it, in any major way. After Georgia in 2008, after the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2014, right? This war did not start in 2022. So I think one could say, you know, by way of this counterfactual, what would happen had West provided military support for Ukraine sooner? Right, in 2014, there were these, you know, narrative, and some experts found the record saying Western aid would have made no difference. Let's not, you know, I think they have been proven spectacularly wrong. And I would say that in a way, had the West really, instead of trying to, you know, engage with Putin, really took a position that some only began to take after February 22, that this is really aggressive, anti-Western, revanchist regime that needs to be contained as opposed to engaged with. And provided, you know, aid for Ukraine sooner, potentially Russia wouldn't have even attacked, if we want to go on the counterfactuals, or potentially it couldn't have captured as much territory as they did had Ukrainian military, you know, had more resources and had been better prepared. We will never know. I mean, this is in the realm of counterfactuals, but I think this counterfactual is helpful, I mean, useful, at least to my mind, to consider, not just an application of what happened since beginning of February of 2022, but sort of more generally, a Western approach to Putin's Russia from at least, you know, Putin's third term, and had this sort of expectation that by engaging with Russia economically and so forth, you can kind of moderate its, you know, behavior of its leadership, which I think we now know that we didn't. And then, you know, to this point of escalation, as Tim said, of course, nobody wants nuclear war. That's clear, right? But I mean, in the way they take this argument to its logical conclusion, then you should just give nuclear power anything it wants, because there is always a danger it will nuke, right? So that's also kind of turns into nuclear blackmail. And I think that's exactly important to acknowledge, that the way Putin has reacted, any kind of, like, many red lines that he declared have been crossed. And we can say, you know, they're not suicidal. They're like a bully. You know, the bully stops when bully is being pushed. Sweden joined NATO, Finland joined NATO. They withdrew troops from the border, right, with Finland. Ukraine blew up, you know, hit the bridge. It blew up the battleship. Like all of these things, you know, when Putin invaded in 2022, I remember his speech. He said he threatened the West. It was very clear nuclear threat. You will see the consequences you've never seen in your history, right? Like it's like if you try to intervene. That didn't happen. Right? Like, does it mean that, you know, US should like nuke Moscow? No. But in a way, you know, giving, I think, the argument that if Ukraine is not given aid and if Russia is sort of like, you know, try to accommodate it, things work out, I think, I mean, to my mind, at least, has proven spectacularly wrong. And I think lessons need to be drawn from that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say also that, you know, the US has been self-deterred not only by strategic concerns, but also by political concerns. In that, you know, if they really wanted to hit the Russian oil and gas sector, they could have done so even harder, but that would have caused great earlier on.
Like what? What do you have in mind?
Oh, like you know, like the cap on oil prices, that could have been from day one. Like, you know, there's lots of things, you know, the Europeans, you know, took a whole year to get off of oil and gas. They could have stopped it much earlier, but politically that was just seen as unfeasible. So in a sense, there's two ways that the U.S. gets kind of self-deterred. One is the fear of Russia's response to whatever aid they give to Ukraine militarily, but also the unwillingness to take harder steps for fear of tanking the global economy in election years, when, you know, 2022, the congressional elections, which worked out well for the Democrats, you know, Biden could have done more earlier on. Europe could have done more, but facing elections, you know, they really wanted to build up their reserves in 2022 so they could have a softer landing as they shifted away from Russian oil and gas in 2023. So
okay, so you know, I find it a little, you know, when you're, as Oksana says, it's hard to evaluate the counterfactuals, even though it's actually what we have to do. But it's interesting if we, you know, given how much extraordinary the sanctions have been in terms, and the aid, which have already been more than anybody would have expected, and given the fact that even that wasn't enough to sort of produce the effects we wanted, I find that, I don't know, I used to think that more aid earlier would have had more of an effect, and I've now come to change my mind on that a little bit, given the technologies of war and what we've seen. But let's get to the other counterfactual that's been raised, which is the self-deterrence. The many of us seem to feel that there was much less danger of nuclear response than the Russians were saying, that the Russians basically have been bluffing. The administration argues, along with not a number of serious analysts, that no, there actually has been a real risk of escalation that's been managed successfully by Washington. And there actually, apparently, some people who I know who have access to secret intelligence have said that during the fall, there was fall 2022, there were actually things picked up that suggested that the fears of Russian use might not be crazy. And so the administration feels very strongly, the Biden administration, that they have been wise and prudent, and those of us discounting the nuclear fears have been sort of reckless. I don't buy that argument, but I'm curious about what you guys think. Has the U.S. been unnecessarily deterred by Russian bluffs of nuclear escalation?
I think so. If you want a short answer, I think so, because I think, again, if we look at the evidence, we see how Putin has been responding, and when they have been pushed, they retreated, right? I mean, if we think about the territorial aspect, they have declared the annexation and changed their own constitution. They annexed these 4 Ukrainian regions, including Kherson and Zaporizhia, that they don't fully control, right? So Kherson was announced to be part of Russian territory. Logically speaking, its nuclear doctrine then extends to that territory. Then Ukraine recaptures right bank Kherson, right? Like, it does not produce any kind of nuclear response from Russia, because I don't think they're not suicidal. Like, what would they achieve, right? And maybe this is where sort of this US, if I remember, like, I don't know what the intelligence is, maybe obviously has more details, but it seems like the general message in the media was that the Biden administration made it clear to Putin that in case of any nuclear use, that they would basically conventionally take out their strategic assets in the Black Sea and so forth, right? I mean, they know that the West can do that. So, like, what would they achieve by nuclear escalation, right? Like, are they going to win the war? Like, no. I mean, and again, this sort of really raises it to the level when there are no winners. I think, again, if we look at the bulk of the evidence, I think the West has been too differential to Putin in general. As I said, we can sort of take this argument back to, at least Georgia and potentially even earlier, like Chechnya and, Transnistria in the early 90s. And then, since the full-scale invasion, certainly this kind of, like, as Ukrainians call it, like a teaspoon dosage of weapons, maybe has gone, could have and should have gone faster.
Okay. For what it's worth, I agree completely with what Oksana just said.
Yeah, I'm on that. I'm on Team Oksana and Team Gideon on this. In some ways, another interesting question is the striking Russian territory and using U.S. weapons to strike Russian territory. If that conventional weapons not rising to nuclear use, would that have provoked escalation? That's I think
what do you think?
I mean, yeah, I don't think so, actually. I don't think the nuclear question. I feel like it's not as if Russia talks about this as an existential threat all the time. Every country who's in a war talks about, oh, we're doing this because we face an existential threat. And if you look at Russian behavior, I just don't see that as the case. What strikes into Russia, what would the response be? Would it cause a kind of rally around Russia and then increase support for the war and increased willingness to sacrifice? Or, it could very well be the case that after an initial wave, people would begin to question, what are we doing here? What are we gaining out of this? And 70,000 dead, 315,000 casualties is a high price to pay for parts of Kherson and most of Donetsk and Lugansk. So,
are you prepared to say that when you say strikes into Russian territory, does that include attacks on Moscow, like the drone stuff?
Well, I mean, the drone stuff, it wouldn't, it's not likely to cause the kind of, it's more for psychological effect rather than to, for really strategic effect. And, that I think would have gotten people's attention, certainly. So.
But are you at that? Don't cop out. Are you advocating it?
Yeah, yeah, I think strikes, particularly in the areas closer to the border, where people really feeling the war, I think those are likely to have more effect than strikes in Moscow, perhaps.
I mean, it's interesting. My own feeling on thing is being completely on Team Oksana and the general self-deterrence thing. My red lines on that are there are real concerns, but the two ways to avoid those concerns are limiting the zone of conflict, unfortunately, to the Ukrainian battlefield area and preventing direct engagement of NATO and Russian forces. And that as long as those two things were maintained, then I think there was very little danger or anything like that. Which, by the way, this is going to be a fascinating debate after the war for many years to come, as Oksana was saying about the counterfactual about increased aid, because we know very, very little about, we barely know what happened until we get the final records, and we certainly don't know what would have happened if you did something else. And yet we're necessarily, as scholar advisor types, forced to opine on these things. I was saying to a friend that now I understand what it must have been like to be a doctor a couple of 100 years ago. If you were Benjamin Rush and you were trying to address the epidemic of yellow fever in 1793 in Philadelphia, which was wiping out, the city, and you didn't know what caused the damn thing and what could be done to help it, you'd still have to do something. And in many respects, with regard to the nuclear question, some of the best scholars in the field are on different sides of this. Okay, so let's.
Can I just very, very quickly to this, on the strike on Russian territory business? I think, like, if we actually think about it, it's not like either or question, because you can say, like, okay, I mean, there is a difference, in other words, what I'm trying to say here, between, say, like having some long range missile hit some, something in Moscow, to having like medium range missiles hit like military depots near the Ukrainian border, right? I don't think even that, in some sense we can say, technically speaking, these are strikes on Russia, but so are strikes in Kherson, which, Russia says it's now its territory, or strikes in Crimea, right, that nobody buys. And I think an argument could have been made potentially to say, and again, this is something like in between, sort of all out, all risks disregarded, let's fight Russia because it's done the wrong thing. And this like, we have to be careful because, things can go really badly. To say like, okay, I mean, military people can probably make an argument that certain types of targets that are clearly military, right, that are clearly involved, like at some airport, for example, that where bombers fly and bomb Ukrainian cities. Is, if Ukrainians strike that's a legitimate target. And that's different from hitting some, office building in Moscow.
I agree with that entirely. I agree with that. By the way, that's the same logic, however, but I agree with that because, and I think you can make a good military case that if something is being used for the war, that's part of the war, as opposed to a more general kind of strike at the regime or something like that. By the way, that's a lot of the arguments that people were raising about Kissinger with regard to Cambodia and Laos and things like that, because there's no question that the territories we were bombing that Kissinger was attacked for were being used by enemy forces to supply things in Vietnam. So you get into complicated territory, but I agree with you, is if it's connected to the war effort, it becomes fair game, the direct war.
So Gideon, does that then mean that, staging areas that are delivering aid to Ukraine and Poland and Romania are also fair game,
so that's an interesting question, and I guess my whole point there is that's why I kind of like the bright line argument, because you don't want to get too far away, and that was exactly why someone like Kissinger was doing it sort of secretly, which is not, I'm not defending it entirely. I'm just saying that the idea of trying to do something that was militarily connected without necessarily formally broadening the war is the same kind of dilemma you're confronting now. So based on arguments from you guys and what I've seen in my trips to Ukraine over the war, I came to the conclusion by last spring and summer that what we should be doing was, again, full team Oksana and FRYE, going for 91 borders and just doing it as long as supplying aid necessary to allow the Ukrainians to fight as long as necessary until they could literally push the Russians back to the 91 borders and then garrison those borders until the Russians eventually agreed to stop. And I now still feel that's the right course if the aid could be done, managed to summon up to achieve keeping Ukraine in the war for a substantial period, precisely for the same reasons that Oksana was talking about, that eventually, if you could supply the military aid to do so, Ukrainian will would outlast Russian will and Russian political will, given the stakes in the conflict for both sides. But and so if it could be done to, let's say, use the aid from Russian assets, that would be a way to achieve that. Let's actually focus on that because it's just come up in recent days as a possibility. Oksana, explain a little bit basically what that move would involve and why it hasn't been done until now. And both of you say whether you favor doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I'm a great expert on this, but basically, can just summarize what I've been reading, and it seems like it's very much a moving on discussion. Like it's not that a particular conclusion or decision has been reached, but it seems like the media has reported that both Biden administration, which apparently was against, doing that, now is kind of more leaning towards agreement, and they are in discussion with the Europeans, but also, a bunch of Russian assets being seized. And so it seems like the dilemma here is this: on the one hand, these are Russian government assets. Russian government is engaged in this war of aggression, right? It has created all sorts of costs for Ukraine. I mean, we can think about, reconstruction costs. So it's not just about the military. I mean, this money could potentially be used for, other forms of support for Ukraine. And the counter argument seems to be that this kind of creates a precedent. And, as Tim was saying, that economic concerns or economic considerations of domestic political actors and business is an important factor. So if the West sort of creates this precedent of seizing sovereign assets, could it limit, other countries investing in whatever it is, the federal, monetary mechanisms and keeping its money? And could there be sort of negative economic reverberations for, US in particular, or the West more generally? So that sort of seems to be part of the discussion, ongoing now. But if, say, it did go through, and I would say, I mean, I obviously I'm not an economist or, Western politician, but to me, it seems the argument that any kind of Western autocratic regime is entitled to keep its ill-gotten money in Western banks and should be protected. I mean, think about Hitler's assets, right? I mean, if we want to sort of take this, analogy, the idea that, they invested in the money in Switzerland or what have you, and the Swiss can't give it to the victims, right? I mean, now I think probably most people would say this is a ridiculous argument. So again, I think if we sort of want to make moral reasoning, I think certainly a case could be made very strongly that this money can and should be used to remedy the damage that Russia had done in this war of aggression. But again, if it will happen, and if, say, this money, either all of it or maybe only interest from it would be used, and would it be used for military aid, or only potentially for civilian / economic aid? So I think these are all still open questions. So and the second part of your question was what?
No, that's the part. Tim, what do you think?
So one of the issues, this is $300 billion. That's a lot. We're talking 60 billion in the Senate discussion and the White House proposal. So we're talking, 5 times more than that. So this is, really, really big money. Most of it's held in Europe, though. A lot of it is in Swiss banks, and so this is something that the U.S. would have to get other countries on board to do. That's been one of the kind of technical concerns. And there is this concern that money that's held in euros or in dollars, if it suddenly becomes vulnerable to seizure, then in the future will countries be unwilling to hold their assets in dollars or euros because they'll seen as as less reliable, and would you rather hold it in some other currency? And the U.S. gains a lot of advantages by being the currency of last resort. But I think with the with the difficulties in the Congress, and I have some thoughts on that. I hope we get to. This strategy is looking a lot more attractive to the Biden administration, and surprisingly in Europe as well. the Germans have been much more, favorable towards this than I think many people have thought. And this could be a real game changer. But it also, as Oksana mentioned, a middle course might be using the interest or using some of the proceeds earned that this money is earning to give back to Ukraine. Would be a much smaller gain, but would be a much easier political lift.
So, it's fascinating to, again, the calculations that people make on these things, whether about their legality or their prudence or their wisdom, and how to balance short-term consequences versus long-term potential consequences fluctuate during the war. I mean, we had exactly the same set of discussions about banning them from the SWIFT network, and for exactly the same rationales. And yet, when it was deemed necessary, that was done. So it's an interesting debate. I wouldn't have thought. Again, I didn't favor doing that, but if the only question is you're not really prepared to cut them, to support them any other way, if this is something that gets you around Congress, that's an interesting question. Now let's turn to Congress.
We should, can I just very briefly, I think we should put a pin into this and revisit it, whenever we meet next time, because I wouldn't be surprised if we see the same pattern we had seen with weapons, as in like, no, this is completely out of the question, this kind of weapon, to like, well, maybe we'll consider it, to like, yes, we are doing it, and what can we do next, right? So I wouldn't be completely shocked if next time we meet, because this discussion about these frozen assets proceeded sort of, some say it's in parallel, that like this is completely out of the question, to maybe let's look at some sort of partial thing, right? And it may come, to the West being more willing to actually use more of these assets, especially if we don't see the flight of Western investors, I don't know, to rubles, to Chinese yuan, like where, if they're going to fly from euros and dollars. So then that will be something, I think, for us to revisit next time.
Yeah,
I also think that
we've been hearing about the potential flight from the dollar for decades, and this
exactly
it never seems to happen. So
it will also be interesting to see how the debate over a deal in Congress for Ukraine aid affects that. In other words, if this is the only way to support the war. So let's turn to that. We all knew that there was an isolationist Trumpy wing of the Republican Party that was at least talking about cutting off Ukraine. I don't think any of us expected it would be so large so quickly and that they would actually go ahead with their threats. I literally cannot believe what I'm seeing in Congress. I feel like Wallace Shawn in The Princess Bride. Every few months I go, inconceivable, and it's you don't know what that word means because clearly things that I didn't think were possible are happening on a regular basis. But it now looks like there is actually, there's a game of chicken being played with the United States international position, not just on the debt limit, but on this kind of aid to Ukraine at the center of the Western alliance. Do either of you, what are your thoughts on what's happening in Congress and on the prospects for a deal that will actually allow Ukraine aid to continue at a relatively high level?
I'll go first. I think there will be aid going to Ukraine, and I think a deal will get struck sometime in January or February. There's some complications with debt negotiations that have to happen to keep the government funded in around January 20th or so. But I think that there's enough recognition, even among the Republicans, that they don't want to be blamed if things go south in Russia, in Ukraine, and Russia is able to claim some kind of victory. I think there's also recognition among the Democrats that the border is a real problem, and that maybe I'm too optimistic about this, but it just seems like the gains from making a deal here for both sides seem pretty big. And, I don't think that, also, if you look at public opinion on this, I did a survey in the US in September, and I've been following this data very closely, and independents and Democrats are still overwhelmingly on board. And even among Republicans, if you phrase the question as should aid to Ukraine continue, 40% of Republicans are in favor of that. along with a majority of independents and a majority of Democrats. And if you think that only a third of, actually less than a third of the population are Republicans, you know, if you look at any other, I mean, this is an issue where actually there's much more consensus in public opinion than there is on lots of other issues about healthcare, about the environment, about immigration. So, the one concern is whether or not for Trump this will be an issue that he just makes front and center. That's my biggest worry, is that he could politicize this issue in a way that could be quite damaging. But I think that there's still enough support in the populace. I think that there's enough recognition among Republicans of the damage that this would cause that they will strike a deal.
I used to feel that way, and now I think I was naive. Oksana, what do you think?
Well, I'm on Team Tim on this one, but I'm also with you with this like inconceivable, right? I'm not an expert on US politics, but it honestly boggles the mind that, leaders of the country, not just of the party, but like of the country, do not realize, which would be very drastic consequences. Forget even like if you don't care about Ukraine, like fine. What would it mean for the West, for US national interests, for kind of global security moving forward if Russia receives some kind of win from this war of aggression, right? Like the media has reported, I think very credible, a very likely consequence, various autocrats being emboldened, potential cost down the road, right? Like how it's not going to stop here, what China would do. I mean, you can continue this list. It has been pretty much in every article on the subject. And yet here you have these lawmakers that are supposed to not just represent the interests of their party, but of the country broadly, who are just seem to be either, in denial about this, which they probably are not, or they're so partisan that basically hurting Biden. I mean, was an argument that I kind of, again, not being an expert in US politics, sounded to me very credible, that giving Biden any kind of win is such a no-no to the Republican Party that they are willing to basically risk US national interests. I mean, there is no like other way of putting it. And that's really tragic. I mean, this is sort of extends beyond, the Ukraine issue or Russia issue. It is the problem of American democracy. It's the problem, for the country broadly, even forgetting foreign policy. It's sort of, we have this domestic political climate here, in a country that is kind of historically has been treated as a beacon of democracy, which is really scary, right? Like just for what it means for domestic politics here. So again, I am with Tim on this because it seems like, all of this partisanship and kind of, playing to the base and Trump politicizing it. I still would like to think, and I do agree with Tim, that there are probably more like reasonable people who at the end of the day, maybe at the 11th hour, would realize that actually, the bad things that would happen if there is no aid to Ukraine kind of outweigh, and some aid will be provided. It may not be sufficient, but at least it would probably be sufficient to prevent any kind of Russian breakthrough, right? So the Ukrainians would be able to hold their defenses. Again, like, more people would die there than would have otherwise and so forth. But probably some kind of deal would come together at the 11th hour. But I think like that's still, for us as scholars, as analysts, and for I think any, involved citizen, you should be really thinking about like, what does it mean, this sort of situation that we have with a discussion of the aid to Ukraine for American democracy and American national interests.
I agree. I was giving a lecture. I was teaching a class in Ukraine via Zoom on American foreign policy and the American constitutional system, and I was trying to explain Senator Tuberville's hold on military promotions, which at that point was still there. And I had to explain to them, because it was really hard to get them to understand. No, the entire senior leadership of the American armed forces was operating under temporary procedures for an entire year because one senator put a hold on it because he wanted to showcase some abortion. And it was like, I felt dirty even saying it to them. They're dying on the battlefield, and this is what's going on here. Anyway, okay, so we have lots of questions because we still have lots of issues to cover, and I want to get right to our wonderful audience. So first question from Al Smith. As a Vietnam veteran, it boggles my mind that we've slow walked support with jets, gunships, drones, tanks, etc. Are there any weapons right now that Ukraine needs that we're not, in fact, giving to them that might make a difference? Do either of you have any particular weapons requests, or is it just more of the same? As far as I'm concerned, it's just like more of everything, but a lot of artillery shells and ammunition.
Yeah, that's the if the West wanted to produce artillery shells in large numbers to equal what Russia is able to produce and able to get from the North Koreans, they could do that. But it takes coordination, it takes money, and it takes time, effort, and that's what we haven't seen. And this is what the military analysts worry about. Is Ukraine going to have enough artillery shells to be able to keep responding to Russia and keep Russia on the back foot?
Yeah, I mean, again, not being military analyst, I certainly agree about artillery shells, but it also seems to me that this long-range missile of the type that Ukrainians were able to use to hit the naval headquarters in Crimea, right, exactly. So it seems like those are very effective. And again, they allow Ukrainians to strike far. It's not sort of artillery battle where people die on both sides. And it seems like, to the extent that the few that they got, they were able to use them effectively. So I think that would also be something that, again, this way, even if territorial control doesn't change much, meaning the actual, the line is more or less static, you can still do a lot of damage to Russian capabilities behind its lines.
That's a great point. Actually, let me just say that the technological, as a military analyst, the technological battle and the innovation battle and the counter and response that has been going on both sides has been absolutely fascinating and deeply impressive, frankly, on both sides. To watch what's going on. What would have won a battle at any 6-month period is now obsolete the next 6 months because countermeasures have been developed on both sides. And so, as in World War I, what seems like a stalemate is actually a rising stalemate in which each side is matching and countering the efforts of the others. And it's basically put a premium on the American defense industrial capacity or lack thereof that we really didn't focus on as much. If I had to say, what is the single biggest takeaway from this war for the United States longer-term strategy, quite separate from Ukraine, it's the complete incapacity of our defense industrial base, which we've allowed to atrophy to remain dangerously low levels. But okay, so so the next, let's see here. Let's talk. Wait, okay. Okay, let's talk about Europe. They have a question here on the EU. We've talked about American support. Oksana, in the past, you've talked about European support. What do both of you think about the will to support Ukraine in the EU? Is it lagging like the US, or is it continuing to be steady?
I think the Europeans see this as not as existential as the Ukrainians see it, but they see the risks much closer to them. So they're more. They don't have the same kind of industrial base that the U.S. The military spending has historically been much lower. But I think they have a better sense of the risks involved, and we see less of the kinds of shenanigans that we see in the Senate. In Europe than we do in the U.S. So it was really important, I think, the beginning of the start of the long road to Ukrainian membership in the EU. I think that was really well timed, given the foot dragging in Washington. That gave Zelensky something that he could bring home and say, yes, things didn't work out in Washington, but we're making progress in Europe, and symbolically, I think that's important.
Oksana?
Yeah, I would add. I mean, I agree with Tim that for Europeans, again, if we sort of think of collective Europe, given just geography, and for some of the members of the EU, East Central Europeans, their history with Russia, it's very much they are sort of aware of the threat and the dangers Russia getting any kind of win in Ukraine. At the same time, right, EU is many members, and there is this veto system, so one country can veto collective decision, and certainly that has come into play with Orban in Hungary in particular, even though, at the 11th hour, they found a way to not have him veto the beginning of the accession negotiations. So that's sort of also, if we're thinking about like how Russia tries to interfere, because clearly, they are not just sitting on their hands when it comes to, and they're very well aware that, one veto vote can change an outcome on any particular EU decision. So that's sort of, I think, also interesting dimension of kind of capabilities of Russia to, use both the far right in Europe and these, autocrats like Orban in particular. Polish election results brought, more democratic forces. That's very important. So I think Poland, obviously, very important ally to Ukraine. But then this whole, the aid. I mean, in some sense, I think Europeans stepped up because some of the countries substantially increased and continue to announce increase of aid to Ukraine. I think Germany doubled, the aid that it said it's going to give for next year. But it still seems, again, based on what I've been reading in the military analysis, that EU cannot match, cannot substitute for the US when it comes to military aid. So when it comes to economic, like reconstruction, all of these sort of non-military, they are really important, and they, but the military, if say things really went badly in the US, either, after Trump, if he is reelected, or if this mess in Congress doesn't get resolved, I think it would be really difficult and potentially impossible for Europeans to fill in the gap. So I think what happens in the US would continue to be very important for the military angle of things.
Yeah.
Okay. Dana Zero asked a question about the Istanbul peace agreement and that and whether that actually was a possible alternative ending or a dimension. There are other people have raised counterfactuals about different policies, and some have suggested, Charlie Kupchin and Richard Haas suggested recently that, you could essentially, along with a defensive focus, don't focus on trying to get the 91 borders now, but focus on solidifying the Western Ukrainian future and locking that into Europe. Is there something other than a continued conflict or even a continued frozen conflict that is a possibility? And if so, what would that look like?
So we often hear, as the question asked about, a piece of deal that was, snatched from the jaws of victory at the last minute. And I'm really skeptical, just given, Russia's behavior and their unwillingness to abide by any of the agreements they've signed all along, Minsk I, Minsk II, Budapest memorandum. And just this past week, President Putin had his call-in show with the Russian public, and he said, look, our goals haven't changed. They're just the same ones they were. Denazify Ukraine, use the term, which means regime change. Demilitarize Ukraine, which means, getting rid of the army and imposing neutral status. So, those that were nowhere near the supposed agreements in Istanbul. So but what I would say though is that for me the key issue is that territory is territory, and it's that you can bargain over it. The key point is that Russia has to have paid such a high cost for doing this that it's not in their interest to do it again, and that can happen in a lot of ways: economically, militarily, diplomatically. But that's the best guarantee that one could get that Russia is going to abide by any kind of agreement or ceasefire or slowdown or recognition of borders, just to recognize that it's not in their interest to do that again.
Oksana? Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I agree with most of Tim said. I'm not so sure about the last part, but let me think through this. So first of all, with this Istanbul, I don't think there was any agreement. And again, if we read carefully, and I did read carefully, especially Ukrainian reports that were coming out at the time, I mean, the real issue is, and this is exactly where this whole denazification nonsense is coming from. Putin has declared that Ukrainian government is this like Nazi junta that is like anti-Russian, right? So in other words, Ukraine that does anything that Russia doesn't like. is a Nazi state, and it's basically, it's not just about neutrality, and it has never been. It's about a whole host of domestic issues in Ukraine, from memory politics to language policy to basically anything. So they have this notion that Ukraine does its own separate thing and it's not a part of Russia. For whatever reason, doesn't listen to Russia, is just not acceptable to him. So in this sense, for an agreement, and this is where kind of some of the speculation comes forth, that Ukraine was supposed to, and I think Ukrainians were maybe considering it, I can believe that if there were real serious security guarantees, right? In other words, that we potentially maybe even trade NATO membership for something like real security guarantees for Ukraine. But that was never on the picture. I mean, this is the thing. So it's not that these guarantees existed. And if the guarantees were such that Putin cannot reinvade Ukraine and Ukrainian government continues to function as a sovereign government, and is not denazified, as far as Putin is concerned. I mean, that's exactly what's not acceptable. And I think that was the obstacle from the very beginning. There were never any such guarantees because NATO membership, again, has not been offered, and anything short of that was never articulated or had been seen credible, as Tim was saying, that every agreement before Russia had violated. So I think, I don't think there was anything sort of signed that then Johnson then came and undermined, because this dilemma that what would be the guarantees for Ukraine that outside of NATO that would prevent Russian aggression, there is nothing, and there has been nothing. So that's the thing, with this, with the agreement. Now, would Russia, I mean, what sort of potential other than the continued conflict? I think the danger of proposing some sort of, peace settlement. Okay, let me put it this way. I think there is a difference between a conflict where, say, the border, maybe territorial control does not change much for a long time, which seems what we're looking at. But there is no formal settlement, as in like Russia is handed the victory, as in like Ukraine says, okay, now you can take this territory, right? Let's sign a ceasefire and you get to control whatever. Because that is clearly, that is a victory in the war of aggression that Russia, would win. And I think these proposals of Kupchan, like they sort of very, worded like they would bring Russia back from the cold. Like, what does it mean really? That the sanctions would be lifted, right? So not only it would get rewarded with territorial concession, I think that is like bad all around. And would, again, at best, I think would be potentially opposed, because as long as, Nazi junta remains in power in Kyiv, that's still unacceptable. Now, the different scenario, which on the face of it doesn't look that different, but I think it is really quite different, is if, say, territorial control does not change and Ukrainians continue to defend and they attack when they can, and maybe, they make some progress, and again, sort of we are in it for a long haul, but there is no settlement, meaning Putin has not been rewarded in any way, sanctions have not been lifted, is much better, right? Because even in this way, so first of all, there is no Russian victory. Second of all, there remains a possibility that something changes, even if it changes in some years. I mean, if you think of the Baltic analogy, right? Soviet Union annexed the Baltic countries. It was never recognized. Yes, like de facto they were, under Soviet rule, but it was never recognized as a legitimate thing. So in a way, we can sort of think of that possibility, in Ukraine, and that I think certainly remains preferable. I mean, it's not a great option.
So a frozen do I hear you saying that a frozen conflict is better than an armistice that cedes territory to the aggressor?
Yes, I think because whatever agreement that cedes territory to the aggressor, I mean, you can call it what you want, but it is de facto Russian victory. And I think the expectation is, because Putin has not offered anything sort of like, he would expect, right? He wouldn't just sign armistice and get nothing. He would expect something like lifting of sanctions, legalization of this territorial control, right? So why else? Like, why would he just sign an armistice when, clearly they're not concerned about their manpower? They continue to throw, thousands of people a day die in Avdiivka or get, wounded. So he would certainly expect something in return for armistice. And he hasn't offered, as Tim was saying, that the goals hasn't changed, right? And then it's not really a frozen conflict, as in like Ukraine doesn't have the right to fight. I mean, they, military command can make decisions. We are not going to go on full-scale offensive, but we can strike in Crimea. We can strike in left bank Kherson. Like if there is weakening of Russian line somewhere, right, we attack. It's not the best. I mean, I'm not saying this is a great outcome. Of course, it would be better if there was sort of, Ukrainian, at least like negotiations from a stronger position for Ukraine, and then maybe Russia would, concede and so forth. But I still think this outcome is better both for Ukraine and for kind of global security, than Putin receiving some sort of reward in return for a ceasefire.
Yeah.
Tim?
Because I think that's where it goes.
People have been saying, well, if Russia loses and is embarrassed, we'll have this angry, resentful Russia, and it'll be really dangerous.
As
And
opposed to
saying,
friendly.
no, it's the exact opposite. A much more dangerous Russia is one in which Putin can claim victory. So
Exactly.
denying victory is like, that's a minimum.
Okay.
Then whatever you can get above that, I think is what you should go for. But to allow Putin to be able to claim victory is something that the West should really, really avoid.
Okay, so let's get to the future of Russia, because I mean, I everything you guys say, I agree with, and I support the same general strategy you guys support. And then I read all these articles after we gotten all excited about Prigozhin and the coup, and maybe finally the obvious insanity and obvious costs of the Russian disaster in Ukraine is going to topple the regime, or at least create cracks that can be exploited. And it now seems that not only did it not create cracks in the regime, but the entire Russian economy and polity is oriented around the war. If it wasn't an existential threat, it seems to be one now. And they seem to be digging in for the long haul and able to pull this off. Explain to us what the hell is going on in Russia, Tim.
So there's an old saying among Russia watchers: Russia's never as weak or as strong as it seems. 8 months ago, or a year ago, people are like, oh my God, Russia's not slowing. Is Russia going to break up? We heard this talk all the time. And now, Russia's being put forward as if, everything is great. The economy's booming. Putin's popular. But when you peel away, one of the reasons why the economy's booming is because they're spending like a drunken sailor. And, interest rates are now up to 16%. Inflation's at 8%. Nothing bad is going to happen but prior to the March 2024 elections. So Putin is not going to cut back on spending. So there is this, warm glow that's taking place in the economy, but it's really unclear how long one can keep this going. This is clearly all extensive growth, putting more capital into the economy. There's no intensive growth of new innovation, or new markets that they're finding, or increasing efficiency. This is all just putting more capital into the economy, and then you can get growth that way, but you can only do that as long as you have reserves that are being spent down. So another point is so we did a survey in Russia where we asked the same people questions right before the war, and then we asked them in September and October. And so we asked the most basic question, and I can talk about whether or not they're lying and all that, but to take these data for what they are, we think they're pretty close to the truth. So we asked, do you approve or disapprove of the continuation of the war in Russia? So 43% said that they approve of continuing the war. 23% said they oppose it, and 23% said don't know or refuse to answer. But you kind of figure where the bias is in those answers. The interesting part was, among Putin supporters, people who said they approve of Putin, only 54% said that they supported the war. A quarter opposed the war, and then another 20 or so percent refused to answer or didn't respond. So the notion that, people are ecstatic about the war, I think is, greatly overstated. And the problem is it's very difficult to express any kind of opposition to the war politically. So there is a permissive environment. But we also asked about mobilization. And 70% of Russians were against mobilization. And this is where I think is the most difficult question that Moscow and Kremlin is really dancing around, is how can they get more bodies to the front, because it's very expensive. The salaries are high. The payouts that they give to soldiers that die are very high. And the the public really is opposed to any kind of mobilization. So that, I think Oksana was right early on to say, yes, Russia feels like it has the winds in its sails right now. But, its ability to continue to fight this war over a longer period, I think, is less certain than, one would think just looking at the size of the country, the population of the country. And, there is a great presentist bias in that the way things are going now is the way they're always going to be. And, I think there's a lot of signs that, things are going to be, much rougher going forward.
However much this has been a disaster for Ukraine, by any objective measure, it's been an absolute disaster for Russia. Why is Putin constantly smiling and confident and happy about this? Why has this not produced any seeming regret or penalty or?
Well, we don't know. I mean, this is all performance, right? Of course, Putin's going to say our goals are the same. We've never changed them. He's not going to admit defeat. But, when you talk, you look at public opinion data or you talk with elites, they recognize that this is a disaster. The 40, 50-year-olds, who'd hoped for a career in the Russian government that would allow them to buy property in Europe and to be seen as part of the global community, that dream is over. The difficulty is, given how the repressive apparatus remains unified and willing to crack down, any kinds of expressions against the war are stamped out. It doesn't mean that they're not there, but it's very difficult to express them politically. But even some of Putin's supporters, though, recently have been saying, yes, the initial stages was a disaster. It wasn't planned out well. So, there is, more talk of, things aren't going as well as as the government tells us.
Oksana, what's your take on the relative strength of national will going forward in Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, in Ukraine, I mean, domestic politics is returning, which again is not sort of unique Ukrainian situation. I think any country that has been, at war for a long time, I mean, after this period of sort of rally around the flag, 90% government support, so forth, like that, it's not realistic that sort of would be sustained forever. Again, I don't think Ukraine is unique here in this regard at all. And also, Ukrainians have a long history of being, pretty upset with their governments and critical and changing governments. So that's also, in a way, kind of a strength as far as democratic competition, right? But it also creates challenges. I think the key, the key here, I think in Ukraine, and this is some analysts have been saying that, is that the government maybe needs to do more to prepare the population for the fact that it's not going to be a quick win, right? Because I think the message has been more like of optimism, of unity, and it worked. I mean, it was very important, especially in the early months of the war. But if we now look at it realistically, right, the economy needs to be more mobilized maybe for the military needs than it has been. I mean, this building of, drones on the massive scale, restarting domestic production of weapons that Ukraine has technological know-how. I mean, these are the things that are being done now, but potentially, need to be, maybe the government needs to be more honest with the people. But of course, in democratic political competition, Zelensky doesn't want to lose popularity, although he already lost some popularity, still remains broadly supported. The armed forces are supported. So I don't think we see anything sort of like frame of unity, but we see less unity in percentage terms than we did before. And then, of course, also, the manpower factor is an issue. It's not sort of as simple as in like Russia has more people, therefore, it has to win. I think, as we talked about, it's more complicated. But Ukraine does have fewer people, so which means that, if, say, the casualties continue to be very high, it would create problems. So there is now all of these plans in the legislature how to retool mobilization with demobilization and things like that. But of course, also has to be trust, in the population for this. So this is certainly a challenge. Again, that said, if, say, obviously defense is less costly than offense, if we're talking about human resources it requires. So if Ukrainian strategy were not to try to go on some counteroffensive that they don't have either, the military weapons for or the people for, but really have more effective defense, and these sort of strikes, precision strikes, various, smaller scale operations, probably the fact that Ukraine has fewer people with this different military strategy, would be less of a problem. Let's put it this way. And on Russia, I mean, I agree with everything Tim said. I would just, that because it is such a repressive regime, I think we really sort of reminds me of the late Soviet Union. We don't really know the extent of sort of if there are problems there, they wouldn't be obvious to observers, right? So the fact that this Prigozhin mutiny didn't amount to much at the time, does it mean that there is no strain? I mean, how did he manage to march all the way almost to Moscow unopposed, right? And in a way, I think if, say, things did go, something happened in Russia, like some, crisis, and then sort of say things begin to collapse quite quickly. I think it's possible. I'm not saying that necessarily will happen. It may not happen for another 20 years. But if it were to happen in the next 6 months, there would be no shortage of explanations how there were all these strains on the Russian system, politically, economically, social, and so forth, that it is understandable that these problems arose. But of course, predicting them in this closed society and closed polity, that's a whole different matter. And then with this mobilization, Tim was saying that Russians are not in favor of mobilization, and so far Putin has been able to primarily rely on either these prisoners or people who sign up for money, and they're paying, at least promising, a lot of money for people who sign up and drawing from poor areas outside of the urban capitals and so forth. But is this really a sustainable strategy in the long term? And if it's not, and they have to, have another wave of mobilization, if, say, Putin wants to even recapture Donetsk region that they announced originally as the goal of this so-called special military operation, they don't control Donetsk, which was like the minimum goal, right? Because they were supposedly preventing so-called genocide in the Donetsk People's Republic. It may necessitate more like large-scale mobilization, or mobilizing people from places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, which so far is not particularly affected by war. So that also has political risks. So again, I would just, all of this to say that I think the argument that time is definitely on Russia's side because it is bigger, so forth, I would take it with a big grain of caution.
Michael James asks, how has the Hamas-Israel conflict affected the course of the war? Tim, you just took a weird facial take. What's your take?
Well, I think it's just pushed Ukraine to the back pages. I mean, and in Congress too. I think Congress can only do so many things, and I think it's really had a it's really had a great effect for Russia. I think to take attention away. Russia's been really increasing its attacks on Ukraine in a way that really hasn't gotten noticed because so much of the attention has been on the Middle East. A colleague of mine says, that in Russian history there's Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and Vladimir the Lucky, because when Putin came to power, all of a sudden oil prices went way up, and I think this is an example of him being really lucky. Where all eyeballs are now on the Middle East, it's been damaging for the Democrats in the U.S. and it's been a very divisive issue in the Senate as well. So yes, it's been terrible, I think, for the war effort.
Oksana, do you have any comment on that as well?
Not really. I mean, basically, for the implications, totally agree with what Tim said. I would just sort of add as an interesting fact that in Ukraine, actually, there is great support for Israel. The poll was done recently, and it asked, do you sympathize with Israelis? Do you sympathize with Palestinians, or sort of both? And many people said both, but then many, many more people say with Israel than with just the Palestine. So it's also kind of interesting, that different reactions. So I think Ukrainians the parallel that they draw, that here is this, country that is potentially its existence being threatened by this militant group who wants to, from the river to the sea, annihilate Israel, just like Russia wants to annihilate Ukraine. So that's kind of the parallel that, many Ukrainians are drawing, which is different from the parallel that I think people are drawing in the West, that, Israel is this, or many people are drawing in the West, that Israel is this sort of colonial power. It is trying to, subjugate and colonize Palestine, just like Russia, wants to colonize Ukraine. So sort of Ukraine is like Palestine and Russia, is like Israel. That's not how people see it in Ukraine, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Perspective.
The other irony here is that Russian-Israeli relations had never been better. For years, Putin had been cultivating Israel, and every sixth Israeli, right, is a emigre from Russia. I think that I don't know the exact numbers, but it's a huge number. And Putin saw this as a way to get a beachhead, into the Middle East, and that's just completely collapsed.
Yeah.
I just can't believe the bad timing of it, and I can't believe, frankly, how much of an impact the Middle East war has had in the U.S. I'm still trying to get my mind around it. Why? I mean, objectively, what's going on in Ukraine is not just at such a larger scale, but of such larger geopolitical significance and global significance, and the extent to which, again, it's a feature of American solipsism, how the particular intersection of what's happening in Israel and Gaza affects American politics and culture wars, has allowed it to push everything off the front pages in a way that's not geopolitically serious for a supposed global hegemon. You talked about the luck of the House of Putin. You could have a miracle of the House of Putin. I wrote earlier in the war that Putin was hoping that, what happened to Germany a long time ago in the 1760s could happen to him, after the Empress Elizabeth died and, the third came in and pulled the forces out and saved it. Will Trump provide the miracle of the House of Putin by withdrawing American support that will deliver Ukraine into Russia's hands? A number of people have asked about that.
So I did a survey in the U.S. in September on support for aid to Ukraine, and I gave one set of respondents just said the U.S. has been giving a lot of economic and military aid to Ukraine. Do you support or oppose continuing aid to Ukraine? Then I divided the rest of this survey into 7 groups, and I gave them different arguments about why the U.S. shouldn't do this because they should spend the money at home, or the U.S. shouldn't do this because of fear of escalation, or the U.S. should do this to deter Russia and other hegemons, or the U.S. needs to do this because Ukraine is a democracy that's having its human rights violated. And then I also had Biden, a bipartisan appeal of Mitch McConnell and Biden, and a Trump appeal as well. And the stability of responses to this new information was overwhelming, except for Trump could really move Republicans. When Republican respondents heard that Trump was backing cutting aid to Ukraine, there was a big drop in support for aid to Ukraine. Now, on the other hand, it depends a lot on what would happen in Congress. Congress recently passed this legislation that, you would have to get congressional approval before you pulled out of NATO, for example. And, depending on what happens in the House and in the Senate, Trump could be frustrated, but he could do an incredible amount of damage if he wanted to.
Oksana, what do you lay up at night thinking about what happens if Trump comes in?
Well, I think that's, bad. If I were even not studying Ukraine and Russia and caring about the region, I would be lying in bed at night thinking what's going to happen in this country if Trump wins, right? So that's sort of bigger even set of problems. But just to, to add on this, as Tim said, so first of all, potentially the kind of damage that he could do would be more constrained by this, decision Congress, let's say, would need congressional approval, so forth. Secondly, I would say that Putin is definitely going to wait and see if Trump is going to win. So I think this, fantasies that he somehow wants some kind of peace settlement and he's ready, like, no. First of all, he doesn't want any peace settlement. They want to achieve, their denazifications, quote unquote, goals and so forth. And he thinks that maybe Trump would allow for that to happen, right? So in other words, the calculus very likely in Russia is that, we sort of stick it up until the next elections. And then if Trump wins, then we have, a different playing field, and then we can actually accomplish what we want. But I would also add to this that, I think, given from Ukrainian domestic politics perspective, I honestly can't imagine a set of circumstances where any Ukrainian government would sit down and say, like, okay, we are going to give you X, Y, and Z of our territory. I just don't see that, right? Like, even if I think, if say that Trump potentially Trump got selected and pulled support, people will continue to fight. Millions of people will leave because life under Russian occupation, I think this is also something that, in the Western media, it's no longer front pages. And maybe people just don't realize what it means. It's not like East and West Germany, that like there is still like East Ukraine, only it's now, somehow part of Russia. We have torture chambers. We have, mass graves. We have people killed and tortured simply for speaking Ukrainian, right? Like, this is not, occupation is not peace. I think this is something that really needs to be, Western advocates who are not really sort of looking at it in depth really need to understand this. And if we're talking about like potential millions of flights of Ukrainians from whatever other territory Putin will try to capture to Western Europe, so the kind of destruction it would create, in Europe for this reason. So I think there would probably be very, very substantial Western, efforts to try to mitigate the damage from Trump presidency for this kind of foreign policy, potential Trump presidency for the situation there. But I think if somebody thinks that, as soon as Trump gets elected, then Zelensky is going to sit down with Putin and sign on the dotted line and we're going to have peace, like, no. For all sorts of reasons, that's not going to happen.
We've had several of these sessions. Each one has featured you guys suggesting at the end that things will continue to go on in many respects, largely as they have. And I think we're at the same place now. And as you have been wonderful guides to what has been going on, and it seems that we're going to continue to need to rely on you and come back in many months, if not many years, to continue studying and talking about this tragic war that goes on and on. Thank you both. Thank all of our participants and questioners. And the good and bad news is we're probably going to have to do this again, maybe even several more times. Rhoda, back to you.
Thank you, Gideon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Rhoda.
So first of all, I want to thank you for a fabulous discussion. And I'm sure that our audience might have missed some of it because it was so compact and covering so many of the complex issues. So I'm going to suggest to the audience that they visit our website. We'll have a video posted of this program. And if they feel they missed something, they can review the video and catch up on what they might have missed. I'm also going to ask the audience that if they appreciate credible information and civil discussions such as we had tonight, they should sign up for our notices for future programs. We have a great lineup for 2024, and I urge them to do that. So with that, I want to thank you guys. As usual, it was very special, very informative, and I think we grasped a lot of interesting information. So thanks again, team.
Thank you.
We'll see you again in 2024.
Thank you.
With
Good to
hope
see you both.
better prognosis. And
Yeah.
Happy Christmas
Yeah,
and Happy
Yes.
New Year to all
Yes.
of you.
Happy
Awesome.
To
holidays,
the
everybody.
audience as well.
that's right. So
Thanks.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
thank